This is the consensus finding grid, more commonly known as the group grid, and the intent is to aggregate the data from individuals' own paired comparison analysis sheets. And so one would have on this column over here the names of the players, and across the top you'd have the ideas, the criteria, whatever the options might be. And an individual then will put their name on a line and the values that they have assigned to each one of these options across here. And then the next person does it, and the next, until the columns are completely filled. In this particular case, it was a real one. It happened in Ketchikan, Alaska, and we looked at about 87 people played the game. You will see from this this chart that we left most of the data off. Otherwise, the chart would have gone clear to the floor. The intent here is to add up all the numbers under each one of these options. This is option A from the paired comparison analysis. This is option B from the paired comparison analysis, and so on. In this case, it's A through F. So the values then are added up in the columns. This particular one had a total score of 240. That was the highest one. It's the one in the green here. This column, option C, it was the lowest in value. It got 140. And so the intent here, using this, is to bracket the information. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to deal with the highest number that was available for any particular option, and that was option A. In this particular case, it was called roaded recreation, because in Alaska, if you, about the only way you can recreate is if you're rich and you have a boat or an airplane or something like that, because there are no roads. Okay? So having a road in this, this new site that they were looking at was an important chunk of criteria. It got 240 points, and so then I went to the person who had the highest value in that high option. And that was this particular person. Her name was Wolf Tolman, and she got 12 points. So she gave it 12 points.
So she rated it the highest.
People gave it 12 points also. But this is a facilitator management tool. Find the person who is the most reasonable in terms of being a speaker to start the discussion, because you're going to end up with discussions, right? So that it maintains some level of civility. So Wolf Tolman spoke for a minute on why she valued roaded recreation very highly. Then I went to the person who had the lowest value, and that was Mr. Gustafson. Mr. Gustafson looked at the environment and said, there really shouldn't be any people up here. That was his value. Okay? And so he saw roaded recreation as not a good thing. And it had a 1. He had the lowest value, and so I got him to talk. So it was a minute with Wolf Tolman and a minute with Mr. Gustafson, both talking about why they valued on their paired comparison analysis the particular option the way they did. The next step then was to find the lowest value for any of the options, and it happened to be undisturbed habitat. Now the idea here is we went to the highest to the lowest, and now we're going to the lowest, highest and lowest again, this bracketing technique. And so the option that got the lowest value was undisturbed habitat would be a great criterion to have should this land trade ever be completed. The person who had the highest value was Jackie Canterbury, and she said, to me, the notion of undisturbed habitat is really, really important. And she talked about that for a minute. And then we went to this person up here. His last name was Mensch, and he was a logger. And so for him, the habitat was less important than the notion of there's commercial value in the trees. You cut down the trees, you let them grow again. You cut down the trees, you let them grow again. So it came up with a 0. Okay. He was also an articulate individual, just like the first one we started with, to get a notion of people being articulate and genuine and authentic about their values. So the technique, You start with the highest total value on an option, go to the highest and lowest, give each person a moment to talk. You go to the lowest value. You go to the person who had the highest and then again the lowest, give them each a minute to talk. And you carry out throughout the entire group grid, the consensus finding grid, for everybody to have their values heard using the bracketing technique. Now, you don't do it for absolutely everybody on here. There were 87 people. But they spoke well of themselves. They spoke well of their values and very clear. And the end result was that they said, we can do this. We can trade these large parcels of land so long as we have good, sound criteria and follow the criteria. We can make the action happen. We just have to manage what we do. And that was produced using a group consensus finding grid from the PCA data.
So, again, the PCA, you'd have each individual do their own PCA on the options, or in this case, the criteria. And then you transfer that data into one overall group grid.
So they prioritized for themselves. They knew what their priorities were. Then all the priorities were shown on that grid. So it's clear what each person thinks. So the nice thing about this is that their voice is heard through that grid. You can see what they think. And then it's strategic as far as who gets to talk. So it's not like the person who is always talking because that person is the loudest or the most aggressive, because the facilitator is managing it.
Right. So it's a good way to structure conversation, get to some consensus, hear differing viewpoints.
And this is not quick, and this can be messy. And his point is well made. Start with those who are articulate and professional in the way they present themselves, because it can get ugly if somebody is really adamant about something and isn't keeping the dialogue at a professional level.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. You need to have time. This is not something to start, get into the group grid with 10 minutes left in a session.
Not even close. People feel heard. So even if they don't get what they wanted, the idea is, can you live with it? You want to get to the point where each person can live with it, or at least that's the goal. You don't always get there, but you will get closer to that than you will by any unstructured conversation. Much closer.